Hello and welcome to the 9th episode of the Social Innovation Think Tank. My name is Paul Tracey and I'm Professor of Innovation and Organisation at the Cambridge Judge Business School and Co-Director of the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation. We have here as well my co-host Neil Stott, who's the other Co-Director of the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation and also the Director of the Master's Programme in Social Innovation that we run. And I'm really pleased to welcome today's guests, who are Dr. Lucy Delap and Dr. Lilia Giugni. Let me very briefly introduce them. Lucy is a reader in modern British and gender history at the University of Cambridge and Fellow of Moray Edwards College. She works on the history of child sexual abuse and has published widely on the history of feminism, gender, labour and religion. Lilia is a research associate with us at the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation, so we know Lilia very well, and it was Lilia who made the introduction to Lucy for us. And Lilia's research interests include gender-based violence and the gendered aspects of work, education, technology and social innovation. And she's also the CEO and co-founder of GenPol, which is a think tank consultancy focused on issues of gender. And I think I could describe you, Lilia, perhaps as one of the new generation of business school researchers that combine academic work and activism. So we invited Lucy on to talk about her recent book, which is called Feminisms, A Global History, published by Penguin and Chicago University Press. And we thought it would be really interesting as well to have Lily as part of the discussion and to help think about and make that link between some of the arguments in the book and contemporary social innovation. So thank you very much for joining us and welcome. Thanks. Lucy, if I could please start off by asking you, first of all, why you decided to write this book.
Well, this was a book that I was invited to write something by the publisher, and they gave me a pretty free hand in what I could write. And I thought for quite a while about how to approach what I wanted to produce, which was a kind of accessible, relevant contemporary history of feminisms. And I decided that I had no stake in this project if it was just going to reproduce the kind of existing literature, just summarize what was already out there. So I guess I pushed myself to go global, which took me well outside of my comfort zone. I mean, I'm a historian who typically works on the history of Britain and, sometimes thinks about the British Empire and sometimes thinks about transatlantic Anglo-American stories. But, this was a book that was really taking me into a much broader realm. But I figured that looking at the kind of existing literature, which is so exciting, I'm talking here about the last 10 years of monographs and journal articles and all the flourishing of feminist scholarship. It has approached feminism very much as a story that needs this kind of global setting. But all the kind of synthetic accounts didn't really go there. I guess people felt, well, how can I do this, right? It's actually quite impractical to write a global history. But I mean, I tried several ways of thinking about it, and in the end, came up with what for me was a way of taking on the global, but without ever claiming to be fully comprehensive, right? Nobody can really write a global history of feminism over 2.5 centuries. It's a tall order. So in the end, what the book did was it kind of parachuted our attention in. Our reader is dropped in on all these different moments across time and across space. And I try to, in a way that is quite cavalier for a historian, to link up different periods and say, okay, let's kind of think with the Brazilian 19th century, and then let's kind of shift from there to Scandinavia in the interwar years, and let's put these movements together and think about what they might have in common and where they might have learned from each other, producing a picture that I term a mosaic of feminist tactics and interests and ideas and disputes and tensions, where you can zoom in on the kind of the micro of all these little pieces, and then you can step back and get a kind of macro global picture that gives you this larger pattern and shows how the pieces are visible and are reused, and sometimes are lost and fall out of the story, and other times like a bad penny shop somewhere else. And that was my way of trying to get at this really important global setting for thinking about feminisms.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting. Lilia, I know you're a big fan of the book as well. I mean, what do you see as the contribution of Lucy's work here?
Indeed, I am a huge fan of the book. I think it is inspirational, it's comprehensive, it's brave, it's usable, as Lucy herself says in her writing. And as I had already the chance to tell her, I really think her work speaks to multiple audiences, to like a very broad, wide range of people. So obviously, scholars from different disciplines, but also, activists like myself and women and hopefully people of all genders in search of, once again, as Lucy writes herself, feminist inspiration, if there's such a thing. And once again, as a kind of activist scholar, I am really grateful to Lucy for the service that I think she has done to our movement in many ways, but there's one in particular on which I'd like to comment. So I think Lucy's book really shows the role that history can play in both feminist thinking and feminist activism, feminist struggles, if you like. Because I think, it's just really looking at the continuities and the discrepancies between past and present that we can really become aware that, all these kind of very unjust, unfair gender structures in which we are enmeshed are actually, quite historically contingent, and therefore they can be challenged, they can be transformed. And, that historical awareness, in a way, can really help develop, just once again, to borrow one of Lucy's expressions, feminist imagination. And I really like to think of feminist imagination as, this kind of capacity to imagine, to foresee, to picture something that doesn't exist yet. And there's plenty of examples of that capacity, of that imagination in Lucy's book. So yeah, I'm a big fan, as you can tell.
Lilia, thank you. Yeah, I love that stress on the dreams of feminism, and to understand how those dreams have been produced in such diverse settings, right? Sometimes we sort of assume that feminism comes from some sort of canonical European origin, but actually the dreams are as diverse as global history. It ranges across everywhere. And one of the kind of founding moments for me, maybe the founding moment is wrong, because I don't think actually there is any kind of identifiable one place where feminism is founded. I want to really pluralize it. But for the book, one of the founding moments is this fabulous bit of writing by Rokeya Hussain, who was writing in British governed India, in colonial India, but in what today would be Bangladesh. She's a Muslim writer, and she had this fantasy of what the world would look like if it was governed by women. She called it Ladyland, and her Ladyland is just an extraordinary vision of a world in which women have power, in which they have knowledge, in which they sponsor research, but also where women are not. They're not afraid to use weapons, right? They develop these fantastically science fiction sounding weapons of using lasers that are powered by the sun. And this is early 20th century. And they defend their land against, the depredations of men. And it's a brilliant vision. And that, that as a kind of starting point, we clear away a lot of the English speaking or European texts, and we go somewhere else and we get a really different kind of feminism as a result.
That's really interesting. Thank you. One of the things that's really striking is in the book is the way that you really carefully unpack, I suppose, the variance in feminism, the variance in the struggle for equality across time and space throughout history. But I was interested in thinking also about what you see as the commonalities between the very different struggles that you describe in the book.
Yeah, the variance is that's a really important political point, to recognize that there is no singular feminism. So instead to talk about feminisms, it's a bit of an ugly way of putting it, but I've kind of absorbed it now into my practice, and I think we should all be talking about feminisms. I continually get asked by people who learn that I write about the history of feminisms, and they say, just tell me what it is, right? Just tell me, just give me a workable definition, stop messing around, tell me, what is it? And so there's a real desire to kind of simplify it down to some, definable, some simple set of demands, some simple manifesto. And it's really freeing to be told historically, actually, there's any number of very incompatible, diverse ways of understanding feminisms. They might share a sense of collective struggle. They might share a sense of the empowerment of women, and sometimes women and non-binary people too. But we can't really boil them down ideologically or in terms of their strategies or what they're asking for to any kind of single slate that is a feminism. So pluralizing it is very helpful. It reflects that historical reality that people have come to it with different goals, but it also reminds us that feminisms have not always been universally benign towards all women, right? And it's very helpful to say, well, okay, this is a particular version of feminism that was produced by a white-dominated movement or a heterosexually oriented movement at a particular point in time or a place in time, and therefore it's not likely to meet the needs of all women or all women and non-binary individuals. So that really helps us to get away from the sense that feminism has been too white or too Eurocentric or too middle class or too heterosexual to meet the needs of people of color and working class people. And in fact, in the book, I really try and foreground the way in which a lot of feminist innovation has come from communities of color and from working class women and from lesbians and non-binary individuals and, from the margins, if you like. And that gives us a way of understanding the kind of the power dynamics of feminisms. But then, Paul, to come to that question about commonality, right? What is shared? It would be too kind of glib and pat to say, oh, well, here's the kernel that they all share. But I do think that looking historically, we can see lots and lots of adaptations of kind of similar concerns or techniques and tools. There's lots of tactics that are shared. So, for example, one of the ones that I found really striking and really enjoyed thinking about was the way in which women's bodies have figured as a site both of patriarchal power, but also of protest and agency. And in particular, the idea that women taking off their clothes might be a tactic which drew attention to their experiences of violence and oppression, tried to shame their critics, tried to create solidarities between women. And that was a tactic that was used by women in Nigeria contesting colonial occupation by the British. It was used by labor activists in South Korea trying to get rights to employment and labor protections. It was used by some quite right-wing, I guess I would say, Ukrainian activists who were mobilizing as what they called new feminists in Ukrainian context, and in fact went down quite an Islamophobic route in some of their protests. It was used in the Australian women's liberation movement on marches and protests to indicate sisterhood and solidarity. It means so many different things, but it's so interesting that that tactic comes up again and again and again. So thinking in this really broad way, this broad span of feminist history allows us to see those little points of commonality without assuming that something like nakedness or taking your clothes off means the same thing in every setting.
Great. Thank you very much. Neil? Can't hear you.
I enjoyed the book immensely as well. I like the way that you use history, as Lilia said, and how you use ideas from global history. The themes were, I thought, was really, really good. So a core insight in the book is that feminism is and always has been malleable and usable. Lilia mentioned this. What do you actually mean by that, please?
So the malleability is, I guess, getting at the idea that feminist strategies have been innovative, to come to your theme of social innovation, in their ability to evolve and to hybridize and adapt around different settings. And there's been some brilliant scholarship that looks at the way in which texts have traveled, or sometimes individuals or movement tactics have traveled, and have brought their concerns to different settings and transformed them in those different settings. So, for example, we can see one of the really interesting channels for influence. Well, there's a variety, but for example, processes of exile and in particular, the thinking about the way in which early 20th century Chinese exiles went to Japan, and in Japan encountered the Japanese and the Russian anarchist movements, and drew from them a whole load of inspiration, but also brought with them particular kinds of ideological traditions and, Confucian traditions. And, there was this amazing moment of encounter that made for a very malleable environment that created an upsurge in thinking that wouldn't have named itself necessarily as feminist, but which we can ask as historians of feminism and people who are active in feminist movements. We can ask, how does this fit with certain kinds of other movements that do name themselves feminist? So the malleability is there, and sometimes this stretches over, considerable amounts of time. So thinking about the malleability of the idea of motherhood as a source of difference and as a source of solidarity between women, but also as a site of vulnerability, and sometimes the way in which women's motherhood allows them to be policed by churches or other kinds of religious institutions, or by states, or by communities. You see that from the revolutionary period of the 18th century, you see it through the 19th century, you see it in the 20th century. So you get these really interesting threads of ideas about key feminist entry points, I guess, into thinking about oppression and empowerment. Usability, well, this comes back to Lilia's point about the past, right? The past is a usable resource for us. The past is usable because it shows us how things can be different. So it inspires us that change is possible in the most profound ways, right? The past is not just a little bit different, but there are extraordinarily different ways of organizing society and accounting for gender, which take us away from the gender binary in some contexts, which really upend our conventional status quo and how we think gender might operate and what it means. So it's very usable, I think, for our contemporary activists to see that, to see difference, to see the past as a site of discontinuity. But also, I think usability is sometimes about continuities with the past, to see that we might sometimes be confronting similar issues, that we might find the debates of the past really usable and workable for addressing present day issues. So, to take a really contentious example, let's think about the place that trans and non-binary gender has in today's feminist debate. This is a place where a lot of people feel like they are paralyzed. They don't know how to think about trans. There's a massive division and a rift between the groups who call themselves gender critical and the groups who would see themselves as trans friendly. And looking back to the past and realizing that actually these issues were also visible in the past, that non-binary individuals are not like somehow just a 21st century phenomenon, but that they were there in the past, and sometimes these debates were had, and sometimes workable solutions were found. That is really inspiring for us. So that is what I would say is sometimes there for usable history. History is about difference, but it can also be about continuity and strong elements of resonance.
Lilia, did you any thoughts on that?
Gosh, yeah, many. So on usability, I think there's a lot in the book that is usable. In my mind, Lucy's written a quite visual book, if you like. There's lots of images there that I think will stay with me and with all readers for a long while after they've read the book. And I think images and obviously words and metaphors are quite important for us to make sense of who we are, and that's also needed obviously to organize for progressive change. But beyond that, beyond the usability of this inspiration, food for thought, I think there are also so many pages in which I think you, Lucy, really deal with strategic matters, like the actual lived strategy of the feminist movement. You talk about how to build coalitions, how to build trans movement alliances, and you also don't shy away from kind of describing the tensions that are embedded in that. So, for example, I was very taken with your description of how, in times of obviously colonialism and imperialism, the word enslavement was used quite consciously by white women to describe, to portray their experiences. And going back to usability, that has made me think about how, for example, some environmentalist activists today might use words such as rape to talk of animal rights or ecocide. And I think, these are open questions your book kind of powerfully speaks to, because obviously creating intersectional and transmovement alliances is a key part of our job. But I think it's also important to reflect on the rhetorical and symbolic choices that we make when we juxtapose one pattern of oppression to the other. So once again, very, very usable, very relevant to contemporary debates.
Thank you both. So in the book, you draw on a huge range of examples, as you said, from in time and place, Russia, Egypt, Germany. What was the most interesting example to research and write?
Yeah, it's hard. That's such a great question. And it's very hard for me to pick out the one thing that was my favorite. I learned a huge amount by looking at Japan. I think that was an area where, I hadn't worked on Japanese history. And so it was really exciting to discover Japanese feminist writing and the ways in which feminist ideas in Japan emerged really simultaneously to the Anglo-American realm that I know better, as a historian who's looked a lot at early 20th century British and United States as locations for feminist thinking. So really, it was exciting to realize that, there is no dissemination from Western Europe or the United States. Instead, Japanese feminists are coming up with ideas at around the same time, and they are in dialogue. But this is, very much a kind of an equal dialogue. I was really fascinated by the Japanese women's liberation movement in the 1970s and 1980s, which was very influential on the thinking and the evolution of some globally famous figures like Kate Millett, who spent time in Japan as an artist. And in particular, the kind of extraordinary writing of Tanaka Mitsu, who was one of the most prominent Japanese women's liberation writers, who wrote this incredible piece called Liberation from the Toilet. And this is just the most powerful metaphor of the idea that women's bodies are sexually used as if they were toilets by men. She writes in this visceral way about kind of the revolt of women's organs, how women carry in their wombs the violence and the sense of the need for liberation. It's just an incredible piece of writing, and I hadn't come across that before. So discovering the Japanese material was super exciting. If I had to name one object, there's a lot about objects and artifacts in this book, and I really enjoy that kind of. It's a bit like the wonderful History of the World in 100 Objects. It's very lovely for us to think with objects. I would point to a book that was developed in India. It was published by a feminist press called Kali for Women. The book was called Sharir Ki Jankari, and it was a text that was produced with village women, rural women in Rajasthan, and it was a collaborative process of, let's write a book which is all about women's bodies and introducing women to their own bodies and their health needs and their right, if you like, to take up space and to make demands for resources. And what was so fascinating about that book was that its first edition came out with diagrams of bodies and bodies that showed naked body parts. And the response from the women who had, been made part of this project was actually, we're not comfortable with nakedness, and we don't see our bodies in that light, and we want to have a different way of presenting them. So Sharir Ki Jankari developed into a kind of lift the flap book, a feminist lift the flap book, where you could kind of, you could lift up to see beneath a sari and you could envisage bodies in that way. And what's so amazing about that book was, even in that modified form, the male printing firm refused to print it. So they had to go to a women-only printing press to get that book produced. And after they did, it was circulated and sold at cost within those rural communities. To me, that's a lovely model. It's just a lovely model of how an idea can develop, can be contested, can be adapted to the needs of the people who are going to be using it. And it's a sense of like the evolution of feminist printing, feminist publishing, and the significance of print culture really for feminism. I love it as an example of a feminist moment.
When was that published?
That was published, I don't think I remember the exact date, but I think this is a 1970s or 80s publication, so it's quite recent, quite contemporary.
Thank you. So this is a question for both of you, but Lucy first. What do you think are the core lessons from the book for contemporary feminist movement or movements?
There's a lot that could be taken away from this book, right? One of the core takeaways is this pluralization that we've talked about, the need to think about feminisms and the need to go global, to decenter Europe, to step back from the cultural assumption, which is very widespread, to think that feminism developed in sort of Western liberal democracies and really speaks to the needs of women within those settings. So it's the core message is, look, it's really exciting and it changes our sense of what feminism is, to take it from this global perspective. But I think one of the things that I would really like to bring out would be to say, throughout this book, I don't think there's a single case study or event or set of ideas that I explore that isn't contested, that doesn't raise conflict, that doesn't have people who say, this doesn't work for us. And that isn't always, by no means always about, feminist and anti-feminist perspectives. This is within the feminist movement itself. And so the message here is every single political and social movement is likely to have factions and is going to be an unstable coalition that changes over time and which sometimes falls apart, but which can reform and adapt itself. And once we normalize conflict, I think it's much easier for us to see ways forward from situations that are difficult or challenging. I mentioned the whole kind of debate about trans. I would say also around racial justice. It's a very difficult moment for a women's movement to take the North American context in the United States, where a majority of white women voted for Donald Trump in 2016. That posed massive challenges for talking about women's interests and women's politics, right? It was really hard for women of color to say, okay, yeah, we're all going to be part of a women's movement together, when they were faced with this really significant divide around race. But that doesn't mean to say that thinking about race is going to just completely stop us in our tracks, right? It's useful for us to consider what racial justice might mean and how the women's movement has or hasn't, responded in a productive way to that. And so, that is going to be an ongoing debate and is very much to the fore of our minds as we think about Black Lives Matter and decolonize and all these kind of questions of race justice that are buzzing around at the moment. So I want us to think that that is a good thing, that we have those debates. And I don't think there's a single moment where the conflicts that I can see in the archive, can see in feminist writings, actually bring things to a halt. Even though sometimes at the time people said, oh, this is the death of feminism, the death of women's liberation, the death of all of our hopes. But it never was, right? It never was. And the historical perspective allows us to see the ongoing flourishing of the movement, even though there are sometimes these debates. They're never death spirals.
Lilia?
So I agree with Lucy. I think the pluralization of feminisms and the normalization of conflict, which is obviously not the same thing as saying the flattening, the depoliticization of conflict, are both key. And, obviously, intersectionality is one of the chief characteristics of the fourth wave of feminism, with which I myself and many feminists from my generation identify. But that doesn't, of course, mean that we always get it right. And I'm delighted that Lucy, once again, quite bravely, like didn't shy away from mentioning conflicts related to trans rights, because I completely agree with you. I think these are at the core of what we are experiencing. There's obviously some feminists who believe that women or women-only spaces, as they say, should be reserved only to those who were identified as female at birth. And instead, there are people like myself who feel very strongly that the battle for transgender people's rights is our fight as well. And well, this is huge implications politically and policy-wise. In my native Italy, for example, this has created lots of tension during a campaign in which I was and I am still involved, where we were lobbying the parliament for a new law against homotransphobic violence. And once again, it was quite painful to be a part of all this. However, I do strongly believe that we should never stop working to create bridges. And I also believe that embracing a kind of intersectional outlook approach doesn't quite mean or imply, you know, playing sort of the Olympics of oppression. The point here is not really whether I am more oppressed than you or you are more oppressed than me. It's rather that different types, different forms of oppression or violence or discrimination overlap with and reinforce one another. And that's why, you know, I think it makes no sense whatsoever to treat human rights as a zero-sum game, where, you know, if you recognize the grievances and the experiences of one oppressed group, you're kind of undermining the position of the other. Because once again, you know, these different types of injustice are not only equally unacceptable, but one can be eliminated if we don't fight against the other. So I think that's a very important lesson that we can take from Lucy's book as well.
I like the idea of the mosaic. But also, Lucy, you're saying about, you know, how movements shift, change, morph, come to a stop but not a full stop because other things blossom. It reminds me of a very disheartening book called Beyond the Fragments in the 80s. You know, where people were despairing that, you know, everyone just arguing with each other, you know, and they couldn't, no sense of momentum. But so what I like about your long view is that, yeah, there are moments like that, but there are also other moments in time where people can coalesce, can agree, can, etc. So I thought it was very important. My final question is about how we could apply some of the core ideas in the book to contemporary social innovation. If you have any thoughts on that, Lucy?
Well, I wonder whether social innovation is kind of an abstract concept. Certainly there is innovation evident throughout these stories of how, and here I guess I'm distinguishing innovation from invention, right? The innovativeness is the use of the past to continually rework the present. And so again, to come back to the mosaic, you know, it's about taking pieces that are visible in the past and reworking them in different kinds of patterns. So, you know, that you put in new pieces together, you get a new kind of pattern, but there's continuity with the past. So the past is a really rich resource for thinking innovatively. Mm-hmm. And maybe just to follow up on that, thinking about the social, it always makes me laugh that anyone who works on feminism or women's history tends to be put into the kind of realm of the social. And in fact, a lot of our work is political, right? This is political history, but somehow political history is always about what male-dominated parties and legislatures are doing. So, you know, the feminist history gets called social. I think this book is about the social, but it's also about the material. It's about the auditory. It's about how we can hear feminisms in the past. I love the idea of the soundscape. It's about how we can think about material culture and objects. So I guess that I would want to put the social into dialogue with those other dimensions, and, you know, think about innovation through a broader umbrella as spanning not just the social but all these other realms. I guess this is kind of where actor network theory meets feminist history, if you like. You know, the attempt to think in an expansive way about what the social might be.
Lilia?
Well, I think that feminists and intersectionality especially are hugely relevant to both the study and the practice of social innovation. Just think of the concept of, wicked social problems that are so important to social innovators from across the world. At the end of the day, what intersectional feminism is all about is saying, hey, not only does gender matter per se as, a driving force of social and political life, but it also matters because it constantly intersects with other social structures, such as race and class, and the consequence, the implications of these kind of intersections are very often deep-seated social problems. So in a way, that can teach students and practitioners of social innovation to really look at the social problems that they try to address as the multidimensional phenomena that they are, which very often also have a gender side, a gender dimension. So say that you were a social innovator interested in addressing poverty or homelessness. Well, obviously, both of these hugely complex social issues have a gender and a racial dimension and so on. And then finally, I was thinking of the research that you and I, Paul, have carried out in Sicily. So this was a piece of work in which we didn't set to study, to research examples of social innovation. What we were interested in was kind of researching the patriarchy, or rather the specific form the patriarchal oppression was taking in Sicily, in these kind of communities that we were studying. However, what happened was that examples, stories of social innovation, if you like, found us, in the sense that we realized that people there, people from these communities, were obviously doing something about what they were experiencing. So I think literally anyone was vaguely interested in social innovation as a concept, as a practice, should be interested in feminism as well.
I think one important thing is, in our world at the moment, people talk about certain forms of organizing to achieve an end, let's say social enterprise. But I think books like yours open us up to many different forms of organizing, which I think is really important, because we become a bit closed in what is acceptable, legitimate, and books like yours say, well, actually, many ways are legitimate depending on context and time. So I think that's a really important contribution.
Yeah, thanks, Neil.
Paul, do you want the final word?
Well, I was just thinking, this is maybe probably linked to your last question, Neil, and perhaps this is more directed at Lilia than Lucia, but how we can bring these ideas into the business school classroom. Obviously, we're really keen when we're talking to our social innovation students, we talk a lot about gender and feminism and inequality. But how can we bring this into the MBA classroom? I think it's really important that all business students are learning about these ideas, not just the ones who are perhaps more positively predisposed. How can we bring this? How can we do a better job of bringing this into the business school?
Well, maybe I'm just a kind of young and therefore optimist and slightly naive, but my impression is that people care and care increasingly more about these topics. Like whenever I give a lecture, whenever I give a talk, even in a business school setting about these topics, well, students love it. They're very interested. And this is obviously something to do with the fact that feminist issues, even the feminist movement, are in a phase in which, they're being considered sexy, and that won't last forever. Certainly, I do believe that as a movement, we should take advantage of this window of opportunity, because normally after, kind of peak, there is always a backlash, and we're already seeing the backlash against women's rights worldwide. Just look at what's happening in Poland, for example. However, there's this interest there. And another thing I notice is that students, including business school students, seem to be interested not only in gender as an object of study, if you like, but in feminism as an approach to studying, to research, and to life, because obviously these are two quite different things. There's plenty of colleagues who research gender, who look at gender just as another social variable. And that's perfectly legit and perfectly respectable. But, you know, carrying out, doing feminist research is quite a different thing. It has political implications. It means recognizing that research is not quite a politically neutral enterprise. It means embracing a kind of strong view of gender. It means taking seriously the relationships between us and as researchers and research participants. And I do see an interest in that. So yeah, I kind of want to close on a positive note, I suppose, and believe that maybe when we will be having this conversation in 10 years' time, well, you know, there will be plenty of courses and lectures of this kind in business schools too.
Lucy, do you share Lilia's optimism?
Oh, I absolutely do. Yes, Lilia puts it so beautifully, and she's part of the, you know, the change that is happening. But I guess maybe one thing I'd point to is the fact that in writing this book, and in, you know, sort of my wider research interests, and in my interactions with students and colleagues, I think that there's been a kind of step back away from the sense that feminism is really something that women are interested in and women do. And I think it's been enormously encouraging to see men marching in 2017 on the Women's March, men coming to, you know, feminist history seminars, men hosting discussions of feminist history books, as Paul and Neil are doing here. And, you know, really feeling as though this is not an issue that men should step back on. In my own college, Murray Edwards, we've been running a program looking at what we call collaborating with men, and thinking about how men can be part of that program for gender justice. And that has come up with loads of enthusiasm from CEOs and partners and stakeholders of all different kinds. And in this book, I really highlight the fact that there are male voices throughout the 2.5 centuries that I'm looking at, and there are male activists. And, you know, men are fully part of this conversation. And, you know, it is my own belief that if feminism doesn't address men, it doesn't stand a chance of making change happen. So feminism always has to be about thinking about gender justice, you know, across the board as everyone's project, and it can never be simply addressing women. So I'd like to think that lots of men will read this book and think about themselves as participants in the movement.
Lucy and Lilia, thank you very much indeed for coming and sharing your thoughts. Lucy, absolutely fascinating book. Really enjoyed reading it, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.
Likewise, a pleasure.